All right, AP Art History. This is the rest of your images for the South Pacific art, and we're at number 219. This is the tapa cloth that we've already talked about earlier with the staff god. But this is a tapa cloth or bark cloth, sometimes called. This one in particular is 8 by 6.5 feet. And the tapas are one of the works of art that is still regularly, practiced today by Pacific women. Um, a lot of Pacific islands work with some sort of form of the tapa cloth. But the one that we're looking at here in particular is made from the mulberry tree. And basically, the bark from the mulberry tree is harvested. It's the bark is then, pulled off of the branches, and the small strips from the bark is then soaked and dried in the sun, and then eventually soaked again, and then pounded out with a special hammer that loosens the fibers and spreads the fibers out, and starts to flatten and thicken the bark and eventually turn into kind of a cloth-like fabric. And then these strips are bound together to create a big, large piece of fabric. And then when the fabric is ready, then they're painted. Now, for this culture, the tapa cloth is used for many things. It's used for clothing. It's used for items in the house, like tapestries that are used for bedding or for display on a wall, or on the ground, kind of like a mat. So they have many, many uses, and they also have distinctions between them, of course, from the aspect of painting. So the designs and the patterns that are painted on the tapa cloth will definitely have a distinction between kind of your more common day tapa cloth versus something that is, very revered and special occasion type of tapa cloth. That's those variations all come from the actual painting onto the cloth itself. In this screencast, I have quite a few videos, really, really strong contextual videos. And unfortunately, I experimented again with trying to get them to play during the screencast. And unfortunately, no sound will record. So what I'm going to do is our next class meeting, when we review these images, we will take some time to view these videos as well, because I want to make sure, especially for this content area, that you see some of them, because it was really going to help you understand the objects of art that much deeper, but it will also, kind of remain in your long-term memory as well. So we will look at those together in our next class meeting. So another thing about the tapa cloth that is important to know is that it really is kind of a woman's art. Groups of women come together to, harvest the bark from the mulberry tree. They come together to prepare the cloth, and they also then, spend time painting the cloths together. So it really is a female art, kind of a kind of like, if you could imagine, like a quilter's bee, where women would come together and hand quilt, on large quilts. It's kind of ritualistic in its own way. It's ways for women in the community to bond and work together. So it's kind of an important cultural ritual for women in Polynesia. Like I said before, higher ranking individuals would wear tablecloths that are, highly more decorated or more of a refined, painted patterns or complicated patterns and things like that. That's how some distinctions are made. Tablecloths also eventually, since they're still, a common practiced art form today, they really became quite the commodity when Europeans were coming through the Pacific Islands. So they're often sold, they're often also given away as gifts. It's probably the most common form of gift that is given as some type of tapa cloth. I think that it's important when you think about form, you're going to want to think about words such as repeated geometric patterns and designs, that they are also monochromatic. They're not colorful. They're basically made with, blacks and variations of browns. You're going to have concentric circles, and lots of just kind of repeated um, geometric motifs. You'll also see compositions that are very balanced, also including radial balance as well. Also try to remember that these tablecloths were also the ones that we saw with the staff god. Remember how rolled up the staff god was? Well, that was all tablecloth. So when we watch the video to see how these cloths are made in the first place, and then all the meticulous painting that goes on top of it, you'll really gain an extreme appreciation for just the amount of time and effort and energy that goes into making these cloths. Okay, our next image, number 220. So the title of this is Tamati Wakanene, and that is the name of the person in the portrait. For your image, it's this one right here. We actually have an artist name. The artist is Godfrey Lindauer. This is oil on canvas, and this is probably sounding like it's really out of place for Art of the Pacifics. And you're right, this is a very kind of odd and interesting piece that AP has provided for us. So the artist Godfrey Lindauer, he painted lots and lots of portraits. So I included a few others over here on the right, but this is the one that AP wants us to know about. So there's kind of three parts to this piece that you need to be aware of. Number one is the person itself that is depicted in the portrait, and we're going to learn about him. And then a little bit of information about the artist himself. And then the third important part to take away from this image is some contextual and cultural information, specifically with the tattooing. So we're going to kind of go over those three things. So what we have here is Tamate Wakanene, and he was a Maori man. The Maori were an indigenous group of people from New Zealand, okay, and Wakanene was a chief, and he's a very revered chief because he accomplished um, quite a bit in terms of a treaty between New Zealand and Britain, okay. So he's kind of revered as an important war and peacetime leader, that he really helped lead the Maori people to a comfortable situation with the British. It's estimated that he was born around the 1780s, died in 1871. And he was a big influence when when agreeing to sign a treaty of Waitangi with the British. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that here in a second, but I want to introduce the other parts. So the artist, his name was Gottfried Lindauer, and he was actually born in Bohemia in 1839. He is an academic artist, so he studied at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, but then ultimately he moved to New Zealand, specifically to escape military service. Um, and so he didn't want to be served and drafted into the military, so he moved to New Zealand. And when he got there, he started painting portraits of Maori leaders, and ultimately he painted about 220 portraits of Maori leaders. Now, remind you, he was already painting. He was already an established painter before he got to New Zealand. He had painted lots of portraits of, Europeans, but now that he was in New Zealand, he took on kind of this mission of painting, portraits of Maori leaders. You can tell by his style of art that his technique heavily rooted in Renaissance naturalism. You can see that there are lots of qualities to naturalistic painting, but also I do want you to make note of the background as well. So the background is really that like old, like Arcadian landscape. And so that's very important, I think, to make note of in this portrait. You have here a little bit of that cross-cultural um, evidence of, European style and European training and European standards, but with this, Pacific and Maori kind of cultural depiction. So you definitely have some cross-cultural going on here. Um, This particular painting was painted in 1890, and what is important to know about this is it was painted after Wakanene's death. So this was definitely painted from, either a photograph or an image in a newspaper or something like that. He was not painted on site. He did not sit for the portrait. That it was, a post-mortem portrait. So learning a little bit about Wakanene is, exactly what I had said before. Um, he was a huge leader for the Maori people and activist for the Maori people. And there was this treaty that was first signed in 1840 by representatives of the British Crown. And basically, it was something that most of the other Maori leaders were against signing. But Wakanene kind of saw an opportunity here and convinced, the other chiefs to move forward and sign the treaty. And basically, with that, they were able to develop like British, sovereignty over New Zealand. So the treaty wound up, recognizing the Maori ownership of their lands, forests, and other properties, gave the Maori, the rights of British subjects. Of course, both cultures kind of see the advantages from different perspectives. Um, the versions are, a little bit different depending upon which perspective you're looking at. But ultimately, what happened is it kind of gave a lot of governance and cultural freedoms back to the Maori people, along with kind of the protection that they were able to gain from the British. And so it wound up being kind of the best scenario for the Maori people at that time. Um, so that's really what Tamati Wakanene is known for. And again, you need to be aware of who that man is in the portrait. Now, the third portion is the importance of the tattoos and the, the um, costume and the significance of some of those like cultural aspects. And so really, if you need to talk about this painting, you need to be able to mention Maori tattooing. The tattooing is called moko, and it's, permanent body and face markings, and it definitely represents rank. So people that have moku on their faces, on their bodies, it's a very, prestigious thing to have. It's something that you've earned, and it's very, very well respected. Receiving moku was like a very essential milestone into adulthood, and then over time accompanied by many rites and many rituals. um, Also, like I said, signaling status and rank. But alongside of that, it was also just beautification, that it was a way to kind of mark yourself, that was very attractive to others. The men would receive moku all over their face. um, Buttocks and thighs were the main parts of the body, where the women usually would just have moko on their like lip and lower chin area. So I tried to include a couple images that would allow you to see the differences, and really picture how the woman's moku was put onto their bodies. So overall, like I said, those three portions of this image are really important. Coming back to the picture here, also just being able to recognize, that this is the costume of a chief. You have all of his wonderful moko. It's a full face moko with basically very kind of bold geometric shapes, lines, and designs. We have a feather that is pierced and hanging from his ear. We have like a kind of a wooden axe that he holds, with also feathers that dangle from it. The feather is a very important symbol in a lot of the Pacific cultures, but yet, again, up against this kind of Arcadian landscape and this very European academic Renaissance style painting. So kind of a lot going on with this one. Okay, then 221, this is an unknown artist, but looks like I've lost the title of the work, but I'm sorry about that. The title of the work is called Navigation Chart. Okay, it's from the 19th to 20th century, and really what we're looking at is wood and fiber. So what this is exactly how it sounds. It is a navigation chart. It is a map. Okay, that's what this is. And what is really amazing is that these maps, these charts, they navigate the waters that are all around the Marshall Islands. Okay, so there's lots and lots and lots of these navigation charts, and they represent routes to specific places around the cluster of the Marshall Islands. What you have here are an arrangement of sticks, and then you just have some fiber that kind of ties the sticks together, and then sometimes you'll have a placement of a shell, and the shell is supposed to represent the islands. Now, the question is, what do all these sticks represent? Do they represent, your paths, your kind of voyage travels? No, what they represent are currents in the water. Okay, so I kind of have an outline here that just shows you, what these are representing. But here, like this represents the current from the east, the current from the west, and we have one from, the north and the south, and then, all these different types of currents, and they'll also represent like wells and bodies of water. So it's representing the terrain of the water so that you know how to navigate through the water. It's not necessarily representing your path or your voyage. So these are intended to use, like I said, for navigation between the Marshall Islands. And if you're unsure of where that's at, it's right here. And it's just a huge cluster of lots and lots and lots of little islands, okay? Some of these maps would represent larger geographic areas. Some of them would represent just, small water features around the islands. And an important thing to know too is these charts were not taken with on the boat, that they were looked at prior and memorized, but they were not something that traveled with them. So with that being said, these navigation charts only um, were of course only built and constructed by, a very important trained sailor and navigator. So there were only a few people within their culture that kind of had the expertise to do these. They were very sophisticated maps, as a matter of fact. The Micronesians and, all the people from the Northwest Pacific are really renowned for their navigational skills. So these charts, even though they look pretty simplistic, they're actually extremely precise and complex. So what is also important to know is just how treasured these maps are. So these charts are very highly guarded. They are treated in their culture as prized social items. They're handed down from generation to generation. Like I said, only very important trained and revered sailors and navigators can construct them, and then also kind of protect them and keep them safe. So these are a very important piece of their culture. The next image is number 222, and it's a Mulligan display and mask. This is from the New Ireland province up in Papua New Guinea, which is just north of Australia. We're looking at 20th century art here, made from wood, pigment, fiber, and shell. And so this kind of has a dual purpose. They are indeed masks, worn as masks, but then they're also used as display. So you can kind of see they're also like put on posts and used as display as well. So ultimately, what these masks are, or masks or sculptures, I'm going to probably interchange those two words because they do function differently, but they are used at funerary sites and funerary ceremonies, and they are used to send a farewell off to the dead. They are made to celebrate the achievements and the life of the deceased. So they are custom made and specially made. And when someone commissions or buys a piece, for an ancestor that has deceased, then they believe the artist then believes that they also have to kind of put to rest that particular style. So it's very important to them that they do not repeat or duplicate any of these masks or sculptures. So even though they all, kind of have like a lot of the same stylistic undertones, any sort of combination of characteristics or patterns or colors or whatever, they take great care as to not duplicate, just so that they're, specifically customized, and given to that, that one ancestor, and then to not repeat it. These sculptures are treated very delicately because they do believe that, they become they're the souls of the dead, and that the souls of the dead are kind of transferred into these sculptures. So they're treated very, very respectfully and very carefully. They, definitely take on a human anthropomorphic form, but also you're going to see a trend in these masks that there's also a lot of animal qualities as well, but especially this particular fish called the rock cod. And this cod is a species of fish that, as it grows older, it actually changes gender from male to female. So when I show you more of these images, you're kind of going to be able to see a little bit of that fish-like imagery. Um, like a lot of tribal art that we've been looking at, it's not necessarily a self-portrait, but it's just supposed to kind of represent and embody the soul of the deceased. Also, again, kind of merging, animal and human characteristics. Um, but it's also very important that once the souls of the dead leave the Mogollon sculptures, that the sculptures are then burned. They're not kept around, and they need to also be dismissed. Um, the Mogollon express, they have a very complex religious and philosophical ideas. They're extremely concerned with honoring and sending off their dead, but they, also, these masks also act as affirmation of the identity of the clan groups. They negotiate the transmission of the rights to the land. Like, there's just a lot of symbolism that goes into these masks. Um, Okay, covered that. So here's a good variety of these masks to show you that, they all have similar stylization and characteristics, but they're all also extremely unique in their own ways, and that's something that they pride themselves on. You can see that there are some kind of animal features, but like this one in particular, and this one here, you can kind of see that almost, fish shape, fish look to the face and to the structure. Here we have some that take on almost, sort of wings. So you can kind of see that blend and that merge. I think that's really about the gist of what you need to know about the Mogollon masks. Okay. This also has a lovely video to it that we'll watch in class, just to kind of show some of the dance rituals that are performed with these masks. I also tried to include a few more contextual images of how these masks are worn and how they look on the people. It's typical that the mouths of these masks are open mouths and open eyes, extremely exaggerated expression, also exaggerated features. It's painted with natural materials, pigments, used with a lot of earth tones, but also it's highly decorative. There's no part of these masks and these sculptures that go kind of untouched. Everything has some sort of detailing to it, if not by paint, then with the addition of some sort of fiber or shell, or something decorative. Okay, moving on now. We are at image 223. I always felt that this was a very interesting one because what we are looking at here are photographs. So um, we are definitely looking at an art form here, but this is more like how it's more about the contextual moment that one of these art forms was used. So the title of this would be The Presentation of Fijian Mats and Tapa Cloths to Queen Elizabeth. We're in Fiji, Polynesia from 1953, and this is actually your image. I've added, much more to just kind of give you more of a contextual understanding. But in this image, what is important to understand is that what you have here is a presentation of the Fijian mats, which is also created like a tapa. So it's also a type of bark cloth that is painted. So it's also considered a tapa, but these are, just, designed to be mats on the ground, okay? So the women are carrying these rolled up tapa mats and getting ready to present them to the queen, and kind of unroll them like, like unrolling the red carpet, so to speak. So in 1953, the newly crowned Queen Elizabeth and her husband Philip, they, you know, went on a tour and arrived at the island of Fiji, which was an English colony at that time. Stayed there for 3 days, and then, continued their tour of the Commonwealth nations. So during this visit, there were, of course, a lot of ceremonies and rituals that took place. But with a photograph that you need to know about is especially about the procession of Fijian women making their way, to roll out and kind of present the mats to Queen Elizabeth. Several of the women that are in the procession are wearing long skirts that are made of bark cloth themselves, painted with the geometric patterns. Um, from the photograph are the rolls of woven mats that each woman in the procession carries. They are, made by women as well, and pretty much made the same way as our other tapas, except it's not a mulberry tree. It's a pandanus plant, which I put over here, and the leaves are what's used for these. It's a very similar process of soaking the leaves and then hammering them out, to kind of, thin them out and spread them out, and then they're kind of bonded together to make larger, pieces of fabric. But the process is very, very much the same, just a different tree. Um, the Fijian mats are a little bit more simple pattern of designs than the tapa cloths that we looked at earlier. Um, but even in its simplicity, it's extremely meaningful in its function. So Fijian artists today still continue to create mats. It's a practice that is continuing to grow. Again, it's become a large commodity for them, and just like the tapa cloth, it's also something that is, often given as a gift. And so I've included a very interesting video, which actually documents the Queen's visit to Fiji, which we'll just watch a small portion of it during our next class time, just to help picture and give some contextual understanding. Okay. Our last image is 214. It's called Moai on platform. The platform is called Ahu. This is from what is known as Easter Island from 1100 to 1600 CE. And what we have are very large sculptures of kind of volcanic sculptures. And this is a map of Easter Island. And what I think is most interesting is this allows you to see the placement of these large sculptures all around the island. And I think that's an important thing to know for this image. So they are spread out through the mainland, but really what they are is kind of a coastal placement. Okay, we'll talk about that in a second. I've given you just a few more images to look at. Okay, and then we'll discuss what these are. So the Moai is a group of people that created these amazing sculptures. And what a lot of people don't realize is today, I think there's still about 1,000 sculptures on the island, but this is kind of what they look like. So they look like these, large heads kind of sticking out of the ground, but really they are full body sculptures. So here we have some excavation of some moai, and you can see how absolutely large they are. They're complete monolith sculptures. But what we're seeing are environmental issues. We're seeing a lot of erosion happening to Easter Island, and then over time, this is what they've been getting buried. So there's a um, lot of concerns about Easter Island and the land and their ecosystem, and really just the length of time that Easter Island's going to be with us. And you can see over what I would consider a short period of time how quickly the land has been changing. But prior to that, it was inhabited with a civilization of people that eventually had to leave the island because of the inability to self-sustain on the land anymore. But before that, what we're looking at here are sculptures that are that really are like grave markers. So they definitely represent an ancestor that has passed, and a big reason why we know that is because down here, I know this keeps popping up, but down here you can see all of the moai kind of standing in line here up against the coast, and they're standing on these platforms. Okay, that's why it's titled Moai on a platform. That platform is called Ahu. Within the Ahu has been found a lot of like burial remains, human remains, burial remains. And so we know that people were buried here, and then these statues were erected kind of as their grave marker. So that's ultimately what their purpose was. But their purpose also seems to be kind of twofold. We believe too that the placement of the moai was also significant because of the belief of like ancestral spirits. So they were strategically placed around the edge of the island, on the coast, so that, and then facing inward, facing into the island, because they believed then that they stood there to protect the island, and to watch over the island. So ultimately, that is kind of the belief and the function of the moai. Trying to make sure that I go over the things that are important. Like I said, the island has gone over basically an ecological collapse. So the sculptures bear witness to the loss of confidence in the efficacy of the ancestors because the island faced serious deforestation, ecological collapse. You had a lot of native animals that were also fleeing the island. Um, there's also a theory out there that there was an introduction and an invasion of rats, which may have ultimately led to, um, further issues on the island. And then basically there, after 1838, there, was a time of social collapse following European intervention, and the remaining standing Moai were toppled over. So we know that, at one point in time, um, all the Moai were, standing upright, and then it's kind of a mystery how they were all pretty much collapsed after 1838. And the mystery about it is that it couldn't have happened naturally because all of them collapsed with like the same direction facing forward. And so theories believe that it was intentional. A lot of these Moai sculptures were, of course, excavated and, brought to, be in museums and things like that. I wanted to show you kind of a scale here of the variety of Moai sculptures from 3 meters tall to 9 meters tall, and you can kind of see the human figure next to them, so you can see the monolith size of what 9 meters looks like. So because of that, it's a lot like Stonehenge in the sense that there are theories of how the Moai sculptures were constructed, moved, and erected. We know that there were only certain people that could do the sculptures, and that the sculptures were sculpted laying down, okay? And then once erected, certain things were finished off at that point. One of them being the eyes. So the eyes were not worked on until it was erected because they believed that once it was placed into position, and once you kind of gave it its eyes, then the sculpture was activated. So you didn't want to activate it until it was in position. The back side then was, carved once it was erected. And then these kind of red, you know, people call them hats. They're not really hats. They do represent the hair that's put, up into like a top knot. But what is important to understand too is that these also come later. So not all of the Moai sculptures have those, that only some of them do, and that they come later. Remembering the Moai represent the human spirit of those that were deceased, and they believe that they were erected and moved by use of like kind of a rope system, where they would also use um, a big trunk of timber that they would put into the ground, and then use rope to help erect the monolith sculpture. But the legend talks about the walking Moai. And so if you kind of think about like moving a refrigerator, how you would kind of walk it by rocking it side to side, um, that's kind of the legend about the walking moai, that the moai themselves would walk themselves to their position, but they would do it, kind of in that rocking format, which, you know, historians believe that that's kind of the um, metaphor that they're making. So perhaps some of these moai were moved by, 50 people coming and kind of rocking the statue back and forth, to get it to kind of move forward. But, from a distance or whatever, it just kind of looked like it was, walking. So that's kind of the legend that comes along with it. Here's just an image I tried to show of some of the theories that have been tested and how these sculptures were moved and erected, but just kind of showing you one of the theories about, using rope. I think that it would be important for you to know that, just the kind of features of the moai, because they're repeated and they're very stylized. So you have that extremely heavy eyebrow ridge. The ears, especially the lobes, are elongated. The nostrils are in oval shapes. The clavicles for the shoulders are, pretty distinct and emphasized. You do have typically protruding nipples. But then the arms are like unimportant information, so they're always kind of at the sides. They're usually kind of thin and, kind of undefined. Really not any evidence of hands at all. And then the kind of facial expression is, like a stern expression, never smiling or anything like that. And then the overall shape of the head is very kind of square, rectangular like, with kind of that chiseled side cheek. So being able to discuss that kind of stylized distinction, I think, is also important. And that brings us to the end of South Pacific. Um, Hopefully you enjoyed learning about them, and like I said, we'll watch some of those contextual videos next time we see each other.